Okay, good morning, everyone. We are coming to the final section of the book of Joshua. We are finishing Joshua chapters 22 to 24, which is a little sad because Joshua has just been such a great and exciting study, and unfortunately on Wednesday we'll be plunging into the heart of darkness as we start the book of Judges. But we can just not think about that right now and just enjoy the light and the encouragement of finishing Joshua. Before we start, let's go to God in prayer. Father, we praise you so much for Jesus, who is our new Joshua, leading us into battle, fearlessly conquering Satan on the cross. And Father, we pray that you'll give us the strength and courage that we, like the Israelites, will be strong and courageous, and that we will trust that you are always with us, that you will never leave us or forsake us. Thank you for this amazing book and the opportunity we've had to study it this quarter. May it not just be information, but let it transform us and change us into the people that you would want us to be, warriors for Christ with his courage to stand up to the forces of evil in this world by laying down his life in sacrifice. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so let's remember that the last verses before we come to this final section are found in Joshua 21. I'd like you to just read those again real quick. Joshua 21, 43 to 45. So the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. And no one of all their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand, not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. So this section, and honestly, the entire book leading up to chapters 22 to 24, has been all about God's faithfulness to his people. The only reason that they were able to conquer the land and then divide the land among the 12 tribes is because of God's faithfulness to his covenant. And so the natural question is, how should God's people respond? And the obvious answer is, well, they should be faithful to God in return. And that's really what this section in chapters 22 to 24 is all about. It's about their leader, Joshua, charging Israel to respond to God's faithfulness with faithfulness of their own. So, Joshua chapter 22. In order to fully appreciate this chapter, it's important to go back in our minds to Numbers 32, when this was before they entered Canaan. And the tribes of Gad and Reuben and half of Manasseh, they asked Moses if their tribes could settle over here on the east side of the Jordan River. Sometimes this land is referred to as Gilead. And they said, look, this land is great. It's good pasture for our flock. And Moses was furious with their request. I mean, he was not happy because he viewed it as an act of cowardice on their part, that they didn't want to go over and fight They didn't want to go over and fight on the western side with their brethren, right? As opposed to going and crossing the Jordan and having to deal with the Canaanites. They're like, hey, we're good here, God already gave us this land, Sihon and Og's defeated, we can just stay here. And so Moses was upset, but they assured Moses, no, you've misunderstood us. We're not saying that we're not going to go to battle. Actually, we will do that. We will leave our families over here. We'll leave our livestock, our children, and our wives over here on the eastern side. We'll go over to the west, and we'll fight with our brethren. And it's not until after the battles are finished that we will then return home to our families. And Moses said, okay, as long as you keep that commitment and make good on it, then the Lord's okay with that. And you're not bringing down, the judgment of God upon Israel. Well, now in Joshua 22, we've actually come to that point where the battle is finally over. These 2.5 tribes have kept their commitment, and Joshua commends them for it. So let's read, and obviously we're not going to be able to read every part of every chapter here, but let's read verses 1 through 9. Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh and said to them, you have kept all that Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, and have listened to my voice in all that I commanded you. You have not forsaken your brothers these many days to this day, but you kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers as he spoke to them. Therefore turn now and go to your tents, to the land of your possession, which Moses the servant of the Lord gave you beyond the Jordan. Only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God and walk in all his ways and keep his commandments and hold fast to them and serve him with all of your heart and with all of your soul. So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their tents. Now, if you drop down to verse 8, he said to them, return to your tents with great riches and with very much livestock, with silver and gold and bronze and iron, and with very many clothes. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brothers. And then verse 9, they returned, to the land that they had possessed. So I think this would have been a really special moment for these tribes, because remember, these battles took years, and I really couldn't find a specific time that they had actually been in battle. Some say anywhere from 5 to 7 years, potentially. And they've been away from their families, and they've been at war. And soldiers will tell you there's nothing that will bond you closer to a person than going to war against a common enemy, and especially for a common good purpose. And so this is like a band of brothers. But now it's time to go their separate ways and to return home to their families. And Joshua, man, he just wants them to know what they did was so honorable. He commends them for their courage and their commitment to keep their word and to go to war alongside their brothers. And then he commands them to keep that same kind of faithfulness when you go back home. Make sure not to lose that kind of faithful commitment. And now there's a problem. There's another misunderstanding with these Eastern tribes. And don't put this in the Q&A box because I have no idea. But there's a debate over, was it wrong for them to ask to have that Eastern side? And, the Bible doesn't really say that it was wrong or right, but I find it interesting that back in Numbers 32, it caused a misunderstanding. And then now here again, there's another misunderstanding because of this Eastern-Western split. So, I don't know, just food for thought, interesting to think about. So, in verses 10 through 34, which we won't read, but we'll just recap, I'm calling it an almost deadly misunderstanding. Because on their way back across the Jordan River, the Eastern tribes build a massive altar, presumably on the western side of the Jordan. And when the Western tribes find out about it, they are furious. So much so that they are ready to go to war with their own brethren. The Western tribes are ready to go to war with the Eastern tribes, which is an interesting turn of events. They've been fighting the Canaanites this whole time, but now they're going to fight each other over this issue. Now, here's my question, and I didn't put this on the sheet, so I am catching you off guard a little bit. But why were they so angry about this? What was the problem, at least in their minds, with what they did, do you think? And raise your hand, we'll get you a microphone. All right, Debbie, and then Herb, and then Carol, or either way, either order. That's fine. We'll get you all. Yeah, go ahead, Debbie. Is the green light on? Okay.
Yes.
There he goes. It's weird. It's cutting out. Go ahead.
They said they were building an altar, and I think they mistook it to think an altar to foreign gods or an altar.
Yes.
It was like the stack of stones. I think the proper word would have been memorial. Mm-hmm. So I think it was a misuse of.
Yes, yeah, there was definitely a misunderstanding. But like you said, I think their initial assumption is they're building an altar to false gods, just like the Canaanites. Maybe they're worshiping the Baals, right, and whatever the Canaanites are worshiping. Herb?
One name, Achan.
Okay, yes.
That's what they said. That's what they remembered.
Achan.
They said, we don't want to do that again.
Yeah.
They said, that cost a lot of lives. And,
absolutely.
And so what are you doing? You're going to bring God's wrath on us,
yeah.
Which was the right thing to be concerned about.
Sure, yeah. They bring up Achan. They bring up the sin at Baal Peor with the sexual immorality with the Midianites. And they're saying, look, here we go again. Here we go again. Just we're letting God down again, and we're going to be punished. Ryan?
The other thing is, throughout the Old Testament, God has chosen the place that he is to be worshipped at. He commanded where the tabernacle was to be built and how it was to be carried with them. He commanded he's going to command how the temple is going to be built. So this is, even if they get past the paganism and false god worship,
yeah.
As far as the Eastern tribes know, God did not sanctify and say we can build an altar to God in this location to worship him there.
Yeah, really good, right? So one option is they're worshiping false gods like the Canaanite. The other option is they're worshiping the one true God falsely. They're doing it against his will, which is equally serious and equally problematic. So Deuteronomy 12, and this is what Ryan was referencing, verse 5, he tells them, you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God will choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. Be careful that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every cultic place you see, which is what the Canaanites did, but in the place which the Lord chooses in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. And remember, Dwayne mentioned on Wednesday night that God's tabernacle was in the city of Shiloh right now, which is right here in the center of Israel. We don't know the exact location along the Jordan River, but anywhere along here, if they're building an altar here, well, that means they're going to be worshiping God in a totally separate place than the 9.5 other tribes. And that's why God's command there that you worship at the place that I tell you is not random. It's purposeful. It's designed to promote unity and group cohesion among the 12 tribes so that, yes, you're scattered, you live in different places, you've got 12 different names of your tribes, but you all come to the same place because you all worship one God together, and that unites you. And so actually building that altar by the Jordan is, at least in the minds of the Western tribes, creating disunity and is actually a divisive move and showing really it's like they aren't even part of Israel anymore. So once again, the 2.5 tribes of the Eastern tribes, they say, look, this is just a misunderstanding, and we aren't setting up an altar as a place of worship, but as Debbie mentioned, a memorial to the Western tribes to remind them that the Eastern tribes are actually a part of Israel. Which is really ironic because the Western tribes thought building the altar was an act of disunity when it was actually intended by the Eastern tribes as an act of unity. So once the Western tribes hear this explanation, they're relieved. And they realize it's all okay. They don't have to go to war with their brethren, and they can still be unified as a nation. So in verse 31, it says, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, said to the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and to the sons of Manasseh, today we know that the Lord is in our midst, because you have not committed this unfaithful act against the Lord. Now you have delivered the sons of Israel from the hand of the Lord. So now they can have peace. And here is my question about this whole incident. What can this issue with the altar teach us about the importance of unity among brethren and how to handle conflict? All right, Mary has one up front, and then Joe. You can go ahead, Joe, because you'll get it first.
The one thing that I took from this is, particularly for the unity among the brethren, was immediately the Western tribes assumed the worst. So if we were to see a brother go into a bar or something like that, oh, he's a drunkard, I know. You don't know. And until you ask, which they should have, they did the right thing there. But if there's anybody I can trust, it's going to be the people sitting in this room. And I'm going to assume the good until proven otherwise.
Yeah.
So I think you start off on a bad foot right out of the gate.
Absolutely. Yeah, be careful assuming you know the motives of the other person. All right, Mary?
I said exactly the same thing.
Oh,
Don't
sorry.
judge based on a rumor. Assume the best until you have a reason not to. Hear the other side.
Okay,
before-
just do one. Just do one. I don't want you to take them from others.
Okay, but
like
I did.
took yours.
I
I'm
did.
sorry.
I did have a question though.
Okay.
Joshua doesn't seem to be present in this narrative. Is there a reason for that?
Well, it says that the leaders of the tribes and Phinehas, it seems like Phinehas is the one who's really taking the charge here, which is kind of fitting because Phinehas was the one, remember, at Baal Peor. He found an Israelite in a tent with a Midianite, and he stabbed both of them through with a spear. It was a little bit brutal, okay, but but God commended him for his faithfulness. So it is interesting that he's the one who's sort of leading the charge. A good question. I'm not 100% sure why Joshua isn't highlighted here more in this chapter. Maybe you just, part of being a good leader is delegation. And if you got a Phineas among you who's zealous for stopping sin, enough to stab people through with spears, we'll put you in charge of this. I think you can handle it. You don't need my help. Some leaders try to do everything themselves and they don't want to delegate, and that's not good. That's my only guess. Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
I guess it's more of a question. Did you see Matthew 5 coming into this where he says, so if you are offering a gift at the altar and then you remember your brother or sister and you have something against them, you leave the gift in front of the altar and then you go and you reconcile. That Jesus is teaching this whole idea around the altar of reconciliation, which also becomes a theme with offerings that are made with Cain and Abel. This is like a reoccurring thing that happens here. Do you see this as a type or?
Maybe so. I mean, I guess that passage is more about you wronging your brother or your brother wronging you, whereas the Joshua account is more about your brother wronged God. So I almost see more of a Matthew 18 connection where they've sinned and now you've got to go confront them, about their sin. But I think the principle applies that, if things aren't right with our brethren and we're not unified, how are we supposed to go to Shiloh and worship when 2.5 of our tribes have just wandered off into apostasy? So I think there's a connection there. Yeah, Herb?
I don't know. I don't think this is the same thing, but I think that what was important was, yes, they went to them ready to do battle, but they talked to them first. So the principle we can glean also from the New Testament is go talk to your brother if you've been offended, or your sister.
Yep.
Go to ask them, was this what you've done that I'm worried about? Have you done? Because they did talk to them. They did ask them.
Yeah.
They drew some conclusions, but they checked with the people.
They did.
And they didn't act completely before they gave the people to give us an answer. Well, let's discuss this.
Absolutely.
Let's reason together is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. I mean, it would have been so much easier for them to just stay over on the western side and just talk about how terrible those Easterners are among themselves. Can you believe, those 2.5 tribes did and build that altar? All right, terrible, we're better than them. That's so much easier to do because that means I can avoid conflict. That means I don't have to go and have the painful conversation or the awkward conversation. But to their credit, even though they misunderstood their intentions, they didn't go into battle immediately. They didn't just rush in with their swords and start chopping people's heads off. They actually went in and had a conversation first. And they said, let's clear the air here. Let's get all our cards on the table, make sure we understand what's going on. Let's have a hard conversation that nobody wants to have. And we just got to do that. And sometimes in our efforts to avoid conflict, we just say, well, I'll just turn a blind eye to sin. Think about it this way. Think of how exhausted they already were from battle. And now they hear about their brothers building this altar. They could have just said, I'm too tired to deal with it. But instead, they say, no, we'll go to battle again. I'll pick up my sword. I'm tired of holding my sword. I'll pick it right back up and I'll stab my brother with it if he's sinned against God and he's going to bring God's judgment on us. So that's the kind of zeal that they had. And it's really impressive, their faithfulness here. Yeah, Jason?
Well, it's kind of a summary of what's been discussed, but we need, I think, as Christians in the world we live in today, to remember that the world exists in two phases: what someone intended and what others perceive. So what I intend may not be what people perceive. And I think we need to temper our reactions in those situations.
Yes.
The people who may have misperceived something I said need to temper their reaction and offer a little grace and say, hey, I may have misunderstood. Did you mean to do this? Because that's gonna make that hard conversation less hard if there was a misperception. And the person who was stating whatever and what they intended was misperceived, they need to react to the question with grace. And you don't go, oh, that's of course not what I meant, blah, 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 and escalate a situation. Because if we respond on each side with a little bit of grace, again, that hard conversation you're talking about is a little easier to have because there's open hearts on both sides.
Yeah, really good. I mean, yeah, the Eastern tribes, the ones who were misunderstood here, they actually understood why they were misunderstood. That's hard to do, right? Because sometimes you're like, they could have just said, what are you, idiots? How could you possibly think we're building an altar of worship? They didn't say that. Nor did they play the victim. How could you think that we're so evil that we would do something like that? How could you accuse us? They don't do any of that. They actually just say, God knows the truth of what we meant. And they said, if you guys, if your perception is correct and that's really what we were doing, then we should be wiped out. Absolutely. God should absolutely destroy us. But that's not what we were doing. And then they just explain it. And I love how the Western tribes, they actually accept the explanation. And they're happy about it. They could have said, sure, we know what you really meant to do, but you're just changing your story because you saw that it caused problems. No, they took their word for it. They accepted that that's really what they intended to do, and they rejoiced about it. Fantastic. I'm so glad that I was wrong about your intentions. Yeah, Dave?
Well, that's...
Did I just say what you
Yeah,
said? Oh, Dave.
But
This is what happens. You can't wait that long.
I was just saying, especially considering they were leaders, their willingness to admit that they were wrong.
Yeah.
Especially when they left with such emotion and anger and a predetermined idea of what had happened. But they were saying, they were wrong and they were glad they were wrong.
Yes, really good. Yeah, and I like the idea that they're not just taking sin seriously because it angers God. That's absolutely part of it. But because they understand it destroys unity, right? And that our unity is so important. And if we have brethren who are just worshiping God however they want, right, and not following Scripture, like, not only is that angering God, it's hard to be unified. With everybody just worshiping God however they want to, whenever they want and whatever way they want. It's like, that's not unifying. We can't be one that way. And so now, the conflict is resolved, right? They're at peace with God and with each other as a nation. It kind of reminds me of Psalm 133:1. Behold how good and how pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity. And isn't this chapter such an amazing example of Israel's faithfulness to God? I mean, think about it this way. Despite their misunderstanding here, in the end, both the Western and Eastern tribes were being faithful to God and trying to preserve unity. The Western tribes were trying to preserve unity and faithfulness by tearing down apostasy. But the Eastern tribes were trying to preserve unity and faithfulness by building a memorial. So the book of Joshua, it's just truly the high point in Israel's history. And we see God was faithful to them, Joshua 1 through 21. And now in Joshua 22, Israel is being faithful to God. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture. Any questions or comments about chapter 22 before we get into chapter 23? Okay, well, in the final two chapters, Joshua understands his life is almost over. He's coming to the end of his life. He's old now. He's not going to be around much longer. And so before he dies, he wants to make sure to charge Israel to continue to hold on to their faithfulness and to continue to hold on to God and to cling to God and to never let go. In the previous chapter, he charged the eastern tribes, but here he's going to charge all of Israel. And so, again, let's just read a section of this. Let's read 2 through 13. Joshua called for all Israel, for their elders and heads and their judges and their officers, and said to them, I am old, advanced in years, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations because of you. For the Lord your God is he who has been fighting for you. See, I have apportioned to you these nations which remain as an inheritance for your tribes, with all the nations which I have cut off from the Jordan, even to the great sea, to the setting of the sun. The Lord your God, he will thrust them out from before you and drive them from before you, and you will possess their land, just as the Lord your God promised you. Be very firm then to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you may not turn aside from it to the right hand or to the left, so that you will not associate with these nations, these which remain among you, or mention the name of their gods, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. But you are to cling to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out great and strong nations from before you. And as for you, no man has stood before you to this day. One of your men puts to flight 1,000. For the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised you. So take diligent heed to yourselves to love the Lord your God. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain among you, and intermarry with them so that you associate with them and they with you, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you, but they will be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes until you perish from off this good land which the Lord your God has given you. So again, under Joshua, Israel shattered the major backbone of Canaanite power. But in the future, each individual tribe is going to have to keep fighting to push out the Canaanites completely. And like I mentioned before the Lord's Supper this morning, think about how exhausting this is going to be for these tribes to just have to keep fighting and dealing with Canaanites in the years to come. They're going to have to live with their heads on swivels. They're going to have to live with a sense of mission and purpose to continue the work that Joshua started. And while that's a great thing, and it's God's will for them, it's going to be tiring. And Joshua knows it's going to be tempting to stop fighting and to just make peace with the Canaanites and intermarry with them so that we can form alliances and maybe even adopt their worship of their false gods so that we can all just get along and life will just be so much easier. But Joshua's charge is you make sure to cling to God and not to these nations. And he knows, as hard as this will be, it's possible. Because the same God who has fought for them all this way will continue fighting for them in these future battles as long as they stay faithful to God. And it's so crucial to follow Joshua's charge because if they fail to drive these nations out, the nations will be like a curse to them to make their lives miserable until eventually they are the ones who are destroyed and driven out of the land. Someone's getting driven out. It's either going to be the Israelites or it's going to be the Canaanites. Here's a question. What are some applications in this chapter to our lives as Christians? In chapter 23, thinking of it as a whole, we read 13 of the 16 verses, but what application, then again, I didn't put this on your sheet, so it's so hard to make a sheet ahead of time because I don't know what I'm going to ask. So what are some applications of this chapter to our lives as Christians? All right. Anna has one in the back, and then, whoop, okay, we'll get it. Where are you going? You going to Anna? Sorry. Okay. All right, Debbie, and then Anna, and then we'll have Jeremy up here. Go ahead, Debbie.
Well, it's just that we are constantly striving to get rid of sin in our lives,
All right.
and faithful to God, and it's the same thing.
Yeah, there you go.
It's just the same thing.
Yeah, we're still surrounded by Canaanites, right? I mean, it's just there's evil all around us. Jesus did the primary work of breaking Satan's backbone and the power of the spiritual forces on the cross, but there's still battles that we have to fight and to stay alert with. Yeah, Anna?
We as Christians should be unified with each other and as you already said, be strong and courageous out in the world because it's difficult.
Yeah.
And God's always promised His support. We can go to prayer and stuff.
Yeah.
And we should have unwavering faith.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's Canaanites around us. It's going to be hard and exhausting, but we've got God on our side. And we've got Jesus on our side. We can absolutely do it. Jeremy?
Well, it looks like what I was really intrigued by was verse 10 on chapter 23.
Okay.
We're powerful.
I know.
With God on our side, we are absolutely powerful. He's saying one man shall chase 1,000. Mm-hmm. So I think if we keep our faith, God has given us an assurance that He's going to give it us. He's given us power beyond imagination to be able to do what we needed to get done.
Absolutely. You know, and Paul in Ephesians 1, he prays for those brethren that you would appreciate and just understand the surpassing greatness of the power of God that works within us and works toward you. I mean, that is amazing. We just don't understand the nuclear reactive power that we have by God's Spirit, right? That we have at our fingertips every day. And sometimes we walk around defeated and discouraged as Christians when actually, no, we are victorious in Christ. We just got to put our faith in Him. Yeah, Herb?
So, I'm not sure.
Is it on? Oh, there we go.
It wasn't on.
okay.
Please don't turn off the mic, please. So I haven't noticed this before, but verse 1 of 23 says, the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their surrounding enemies. And just as Jeremy said in verse 10, he talks about one man of you puts to flight 1,000. This is an odd rest. This is not the eternal rest, and you all have pointed that out in sermons, and I'm grateful because that comes to mind.
Sure.
But their rest is still comprised of fighting the temptation to intermarry, to mix, to worship wrong, and sometimes to have to fight again to preserve their unity. So that's an odd rest, isn't it?
I like it. What you're observing is, as God's people, we can have rest even in the battle. I mean, think about Jesus. He says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest." But then Paul says, yeah, but you're also in spiritual battle. And Jesus says, but the whole world hates you, and you're going to have persecution and tribulation. What do you mean rest? What are you talking about? Well, because the rest is found in Jesus. And that ultimate rest, that's when we have true rest in heaven, when you have the rest without the battle. Now the battle's over, the war's over, and now that is the ultimate taste of rest. All right, Daniel?
So I really like that this kind of book ends the entire, from the very first to the very end. So at the very beginning, God was saying, be strong and courageous. In verse 6, it is now Joshua saying, be strong. So, and to me, that's just a re-emphasis that being strong is a continual process. If you do not use your muscle, you will lose your muscle.
Good.
So to not forget the struggles you had, not to forget the battles, not to forget the things.
I like it.
But to keep on getting strong. So
Yeah.
I just like the book in there.
Yeah, no, I really like that point. Yeah, it's not like you're strong and then that's it. Now you're good. You're strong the rest of your life. No, you got to be in the spiritual gym, training every day, connecting with Jesus, our spotter. All right, so okay. He's not just our spotter, he's our lifter. So anyway, this is what happens when you go too far with analogies. All right, Debbie, and then Terry.
Well, I'm thinking also just that they had to keep going. I had also wondered how long this process took, and then was overcome. Final battle, let's say 5 years, 7 years. But I know that I'm seeing some of my prayers that I've been praying for a long time are just now being answered. And it's like we've just got to keep on keeping on, keeping on. We don't know God's timetable.
Yep.
And it's just, sometimes you think nothing's going to ever happen or change. But then you go, wow, God has been at work. And this is, just like they had to keep fighting.
Yep.
It wasn't an overnight thing. It took years.
Really good.
So.
Yeah, no, the really, really good point. Yeah, Terry?
I think Joshua's speech here addresses the principal concern that the Israelites have had from the time they left Egypt, and that's doubt. Right now, they should have rest from doubt at this point.
Absolutely.
They should have none.
That's true.
And so we as Christians, we should have no doubt at this point either.
Oh, really good. Yeah, at this point, man, they should have no doubt anymore that God is powerful and with them. And after Jesus on the cross, man, and that's what Paul says in Romans 8. Like, if God has given us His Son, like, what else is He? What other good thing is He going to withhold from us? I mean, He gave us the most, important thing in the world. Yeah, really, really good. I really appreciate that. Okay, let's see. I think you guys said pretty much all that I had in my notes. Joshua 24. So this chapter is basically a covenant renewal ceremony. And what's neat is it's modeled after ancient Near Eastern treaties between kings and their vassals. So you'll have an introduction of the king, which we have in verse 2, the first part. And then you have sort of like a history, a review of how the king has actually helped and benefited his subjects. So we have that in verse 2, the second part, all the way through verse 13, all about God's grace. I loved what one writer called it. He said that is, when you read that, he says that's the history that should have never happened. Love that. That history only happened because of God's grace for His people and His subjects. And then 3, the demands and expectations that the king has on his subject. That's verses 14 and 15. And then you have witnesses to the covenant, which Joshua, interestingly, he says the people are witnesses for themselves, right? That if they break this covenant, that they're going to be violating what they witnessed when they made the covenant. But then he also sets up a stone as a covenant or as a witness, and then the fifth one, curses for breaking the covenant, verses 19 and 20. Usually there's also blessings for keeping it, but actually the blessings part is kind of left out here, which is implied because blessings and cursings kind of all go together. What's really fascinating is, and I don't know that we've thought about this before, but covenants were made between kings and vassals, and sometimes even between equal parties, but never ever between a God and people. This concept is completely unique to the one true God of the Bible. He makes a covenant with human beings. A God makes a covenant with humans. And not only does he make a covenant, he makes an old covenant, and then he makes a new covenant, right? And sheds the blood of his son to do it. And so Israel is taking this very seriously, and they are renewing their commitment to keep this covenant with this very unique and special God who has given them all those benefits in verses 2 through 13, that history that should have never happened. And another really neat thing about this covenant renewal ceremony is where geographically it takes place. And you see in verse 1, they are in Shechem. That is the place where God first made a covenant with Abraham and promised to give his descendants the land of Canaan 470 years before. How fitting, now that God has kept his commitment to Israel, that Israel should now renew their commitment to God. And Joshua, he leads the charge, and he gives them three choices. Basically, you can stay stuck in the past by serving the false gods of your ancestors. You can be hip and cool and keep up with the times and worship the gods of the Canaanites around you, or you can serve the Lord. And he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And when the people say, so will we, Joshua says, no, you won't. Man, what a leader, right? What a motivational speaker, right? There's a question why in the world he would do that. Why would he say such a thing? I think there's probably many reasons. One, it's part prophecy, because they don't really. I mean, they do, but only kind of temporarily. Also, maybe it's a challenge. It can actually be motivating. If you tell somebody I'm going to do it, and they're like, I don't believe you. You're like, oh yeah? Well, I'll show you then. I'll absolutely will. So maybe it's part challenge that maybe Joshua knows, hey, don't just get caught up in the emotion of the moment and the ceremony. I want you to be serious about this commitment and really think about what you're saying here. So maybe that's part of the challenge. It also points to Jesus, right? Because it is true, none of us really can serve the Lord and obey him perfectly. We all need a Savior. But in the end, the people say, no, Joshua, we really will serve the Lord. And so the book leaves us with a big question mark. Will Israel keep their commitment here to God's covenant? And the book kind of leaves us on a cliffhanger with that. But interestingly, there's a final section in verses 29 to 33, which is a little bit odd because it ends with the deaths of Joshua and the deaths of Eleazar, the high priest. And Eleazar played a pretty big role in Joshua, especially dividing up the land back in chapter 14. And then in one final picture of God's faithfulness, the bones of Joseph are buried in Canaan. So perhaps, let me say a couple things about this. Perhaps the deaths of Joshua and Eleazar is sort of the symbolic passing on of the torch now to the next generation. It's saying, look, this isn't on Joshua anymore, right? He made that final charge to you before he died, and now that he died, it's on you. But then, remember, hundreds of years before Joseph's death, hundreds of years before entering Canaan, before Joseph died, he had so much faith that God would take the people out of Egypt into Canaan that he said, when you all leave Egypt and go to Canaan, bring my bones with you and bury my bones in the promised land. So by faith, think about it this way. By faith, Joseph is inheriting God's promises even in death. And maybe that's the point of ending the book this way. That if they'll have the faith of Joshua and Eliezer and Joseph, not even death itself can stop them from inheriting God's promises. That's the power of being faithful to God. And now it's on you, Israel. Joshua's gone. What are you going to do? Really powerful ending. All right. I did fantastic. We've got 5 minutes left. In terms of timing wise, I don't mean about the class. I just mean I'm such a good teacher. No, I just mean in the timing wise, I actually left you time. I left you the entire rest of class to answer this question. How has going through the book of Joshua, and we got 5 minutes, how has going through the book of Joshua again helped you grow spiritually? Did you gain any new insights into the book and or your own life? Go ahead, Jason.
Well, Rory said to me, he's like, sometimes he thinks, why do we take the Lord's Supper every week? And I think that's what led to Joshua making the statement he did. And I'm not trying to spoil the cliffhanger you left, will Israel or won't Israel? The answer is yes and no and yes and no and yes and no. And that's why Joshua said that, because he knew they would be very excited when they made the covenant. And as time went on, they would change their mind.
Yeah.
God knows that's a human characteristic. That's why we take the Lord's Supper every week. To be honest, I think that's why people celebrate their wedding anniversaries.
Yeah, no, good point. Yeah, we need the reminder. It's easy to be faithful temporarily, but not long term. Yeah, Daniel?
Serving God is hard. Serving God requires dedication, requires time, requires sacrifice.
Yeah.
But in the end, the hard becomes easy because our burdens are lifted.
Absolutely. Yeah, and interestingly, it's also really hard to be a wicked person. They suffer from a lot of hardship that's a different kind. And it's like you have to pick your pain, right? And God, His discipline, the hardship of serving God, Jesus says actually that burden becomes light. That yoke becomes easy for many reasons. But yeah, good point. Really appreciate it. Tim?
I think there's a lot in this book for people who find themselves in the position of being a shepherd in the church today. Commitment to God. His commitment's just outstanding. Boldness. He choose this day, that type of thing. He's very bold. He has a shepherd's heart. His concern is really for the people, their well-being and their long-term faithfulness. Yeah. It's not about himself being the leader and things like that. And then the fact that he will delegate and he'll empower others here. He knows his realm. He knows where it ends. I think that ending has a lot going on there too. I also think this book parallels the book of Matthew in many ways. This is Yeshua in a different way too. You brought that point up earlier. But for a shepherd, I think that there's a lot of things we can pull out of that.
Yeah, really good. The holidays can't be here because Ryan is recovering from the appendectomy. But Tom sent me a text message earlier, and he answered this question. He said that I am uncomfortably. Sorry, did my mic go off? All right, it sounds quiet. Anyway, he says that I am uncomfortably more like those he led than I am like Joshua. Changing those percentages is to be sought after. That was interesting, insightful. Appreciate that, Tom. Carol?
Whenever we find ourselves in a battle, we just need to remind ourselves that the Lord our God is our commander. And the more we know Him, the more we rely on Him. Just like Debbie said, we have to hold on to our faith and suppress our own inhibitions to find our own way out of the battle and to wait on Him in faith and to trust and know that the outcome will be His and it will be the right one.
Absolutely. Really good. Yeah, I think for me, who's got does somebody have it next? Okay. I think for me, just the amount of courage that it takes to serve God. And that's part of the hardness that Daniel's talking about, but it's just like, man, God, He asks you to do some really, really scary things. But that's the most rewarding thing is when you trust God and you take that step of courage, right? We talked about how the priests stepped out into the Jordan River before God even did anything with the river, right? That's terrifying. But they took that step out in faith, trusting that God would take care of it. And that encourages me to have scary conversations with people about the Lord evangelistically. And I'm like, oh man, if I say this, how are they going to react? Or to have those scary conversations with people that might involve conflict. The courage to leave a particular sin or habit behind when you've grown so comfortable with it, and it just, it's so comforting and it's soothing because it's what I've always known. And it's just like, okay, but you gotta get those training wheels off, right? And go out and trust the Lord. And that's scary and it's hard, but God understands this is what makes humans come alive. Living by faith is what makes us come alive. And every time we say no to an act of courage, it crushes God's image in us a little bit more. Yeah, Herb, go ahead. It's fine.
Verse 28. So Joshua sent the people away, every man to his inheritance. Could that have a possibly double meaning?
Perhaps.
I've never read the verse that way. And
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think
he's like saying, okay, you're on your own. I mean, you're on your own, but I can't fight for you anymore.
Oh, I see. That's what you mean. Okay, I got you. Yeah.
But what were you thinking?
Oh, I was just thinking the double meaning of inheritance.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Yeah,
that
eventually.
Serve the Lord or not, this is your choice.
Yeah, the inheritance of Canaan is ultimately a foreshadowing of our inheritance in heaven.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, absolutely. No, good. Really appreciate it. Thank you guys for making this half of the quarter so great through Joshua. And we're going to need a lot of courage to plunge into darkness on Wednesday to get into Judges. But that's where we're headed next.